very much for inviting me to join you with lunch today and that kind of introduction. Thank you for that. Now, I've been asked to speak about, yes, excellent, thank you, fairness and marginalised members of the community. Now, fairness is right on the money for me because basically my job is about fairness. It's at the very core of what I do. Now, the role of the Ombudsman is often described as being about the imbalance of power between the individual and the state. And that's a mechanism for fairness. So what I'd like to do over the next 20 minutes or so is take you on a bit of a journey from the origins of the Ombudsman to what I'm hoping to achieve in my 10-year term. And in the course of that, illustrating the achievement of fairness and how we can go about that in the role that I do. What I'd like to just start with, though, is just tell you sort of what the Ombudsman actually is and where the idea comes from. Because it's actually an old Swedish word, which means defender of the people. And for anybody asks me, I am not an ombudswoman. I do get asked this question, being the first female ombudsman ever said before, aren't you really an ombudswoman? And the answer actually is no. It is a gender-neutral term, although I'm quite sure that, particularly in America, there are ombudswomen and probably ombudspersons, but I'm not one of them. So I would, because this is an intercultural event, and if you'll forgive my pronunciation, I thought I'd just share with you what ombudsmen get called in other parts of the world, at least in polite company. Now, in Spain and Latin American countries, it is, and if you forgive my pronunciation, el defensor del pueblo, the defender of the people, again. There's a marvelous term in Brazil called ouvidor, which means the listener. And I think my favourite of all, actually, in Guam, the term is suruhanu, which means the healer, the wise and capable one. And incidentally, Turkey has had an ombudsman since 2013, where it is known as the Ombudsman. So, the hardly original term. But although the public protector principle actually goes back to a really very long way to ancient Rome, this is really a bit of my history lesson at the beginning of the journey, it was actually the Swedish who first created the role in 1809. And that was the year that the Swedish constitutional monarchy was created, and the king decided that some institution independent of the executive was needed to provide a check on the balance of the executive to make sure that laws and statutes were being observed. So he created, it's a wonderful term, again, if there's any Swedes in the audience, forgive my pronunciation, Riksdagens Justitia Ombudsman, or Parliamentary Agent for Justice. Now, that's back in 1809, and it took about 150 years for the rest of the world to catch up on this very good idea. Because it wasn't until after about the Second World War that governments around the world sort of cottoned on to the idea that actually it was quite a good thing to do to recognise the importance of protecting people against what was increasing power within the state, the overreaching powers of the state. So we moved to all the way from Sweden in 1809 to New Zealand in 1962. Now, New Zealand was actually the first Commonwealth country to set up an ombudsman. And there was some really quite good debate at the time about the merits or otherwise of this institution. Why do you need an ombudsman? And what I've got up here actually is from the then Attorney General, J.R. Hanna, who said, the balance between the citizen and the state has over a long period been swinging more and more in favour of the state. This concentration of power in the state has made it all the more essential in a democracy that the citizen should be protected against the abuses of power. So, New Zealand in 1962, in fact, as an aside, the UK was put the Ombudsman in 1966, then we can fast forward to Victoria in 1973. Now, Victoria was actually the third Australian state to set up an ombudsman, also in the early 70s. And it's a useful little fact I found when I was reading the Hansard debates when I started this job. It would have been the first state to set up an ombudsman because there was a private members' bill back in 1966 that had cross-party support to introduce an ombudsman, which was vetoed by then Premier Henry Bolting. So it was eventually introduced in 1973 by the then Hamer government, Liberal government, and the comments in that debate were actually pretty consistent with the New Zealand debate of 10 years earlier on the general effect of an ombudsman. Just to take a part of that, it is difficult to prove that one can assume this inhibits the actions of public servants. They know that what they do will be open to scrutiny in a way in which they could not be scrutinised by a court. And reading all of those debates about, where did the concept of the ombudsman come from? The flavour of all of them. You're talking about the ombudsman debate in New Zealand, the debate a couple of years later in the UK and in Westminster, and the debate in Victoria in 1973. The flavour of all of these is the exponential growth in bureaucratic decision making and the importance of having some kind of check and balance on the power of the state in that process. So that's what was set up 41 years ago in Victoria. Now, what do Victorians now think about the role? Well, I just commissioned a bit of research on this because I thought it was important to get a baseline in my office, for actually what I need to do in the role. And I was actually quite surprised at this result. This is 94% of Victorians agree that the Victorian Ombudsman is either very important, that's 73% of Victorians, or of some use, another 21%, for Victorians, so that government decisions or actions can be reviewed. So actually there is a very strong sense out there that Victorians need to have some mechanism whereby government decisions or actions can be reviewed. Now, the research also told us that there's a lot of things that I need to do because most people don't know how to complain to the Ombudsman. Most people actually aren't quite sure what the job is, and there's a lot of confusion at all the different ombudsmen out there. So it's been quite an important baseline for me. But that's actually quite an interesting starting point, sort of 41 years after the office is established. And as we also now know, ombudsmen are in place in about 140 countries around the world. So we know that it is a good idea that eventually found its time. Why is it so important still? Why is it actually getting more important? Really because every day, probably every hour, there are still times when that imbalance of power between individuals in the state in government decision making leaves people feeling hurt or angry, annoyed, out of pocket, or just aggrieved in some way that they've been treated unfairly. So it's about fairness, but it's also crucially about accountability. And I'm aware that this is central to the thinking of Fatula Gulen, who I understand is the inspiration for this organisation, with his promotion of dialogue, respect and tolerance. Now, and in preparation for coming along to this event, and thank you to the Intercultural Society, I read a bit of his work, and there was a line in that which resonated actually very strongly with me, which was this: a person should hold himself to account first and criticise himself. Otherwise, he might busy himself with other people's shortcomings. I thought, there's reflection there, and there's a focus there on improvement rather than on blame and shame. So, what does the Ombudsman actually do? Well, imbalance of power. My office exists to help people resolve complaints about public services. Provide a service that is free, it's fair, and it's independent. Basically, I cover all state government services, government departments, health, education, social services, the like, and their agencies, Big Roads, WorkSafe, just to name a couple of them, as well as local councils. I don't cover the police, courts, or privatised services like water and telecommunications. But basically, everything in the state, as opposed to Commonwealth, except those relative few. So just to illustrate, so these are just a few numbers from my last annual report. So this is as of June of last year. Over 34,000 people actually complained to my office last year. Now, lots of those complaints were about things that we couldn't help them with. You know, people have heard of the Ombudsman, and they complained about obviously about absolutely everything, including, you know, the quality of flowers from the local florist, you know, among other things, and, you know, and their dissatisfaction with the local plumber. And we send it to Consumer Affairs, you know, which is fine, but actually that's not something that my office can actually assist them with. So, you know, part of what we do is provide a bit of a service to get them to the right place. But of those 34,000 or so complaints, there were over 13,000 that were within my jurisdiction. And with those complaints, some of them were premature, many of them could be resolved very quickly, and they resulted in over 2,500 of formal inquiries being started, where, you know, we might go and actually review departmental files. And again, of those 2,500 odd inquiries, also started 70 much more detailed and complex investigations. Now, how do I do all that? I've got about 80 staff, and in carrying out my formal investigations, we have the powers of a royal commission. So, how does work come into my office? You know, what does it? You know, what are the themes and what does it all look like? Well, if you just read the headlines of my office, you probably think that all the Ombudsman ever does is slam, because the classic headline: Ombudsman slams this agency, that department, whatever. There was one lovely exception to that actually last year, where The Age, in its headline of my report of the Office of Living Victoria, managed to say Ombudsman buckets water agency. I thought was at least a change. Slam. But I mean, if you just read the headlines, all you would think is that all we do is that big systemic stuff. But actually, that's just that part in the bottom right-hand corner. You know, these are the big investigations that I take on that don't involve dealing with complaints directly. You know, and the other ones also where I think, you know, where very often there is a focus on marginalised individuals, looking at, you know, what are the issues that most affect people. And two current examples of that, cases that I'm working on that you may be aware of. There is the investigation that I launched last year into the rehabilitation and reintegration of prisoners in Victoria, with a marginalised group, I think most people would agree, with a particular focus on Aboriginal prisoners and women prisoners. And the investigation I launched last year into the reporting and investigation of abuse in the disability sector. Again, two pretty marginalised groups where, you know, I think if you're looking at fairness, you know, those are not popular causes in lots of areas, but very, very important. Because actually, probably the strongest power I have is to table reports in Parliament, and the recommendations that come out of those reports, which are currently tracking at about 100% take-up rate. And when I table those reports, I'll be and making those recommendations, you know, just to hark back to the sage words of Gulen, will not be obsessing over the shortcomings of others, but instead seeking fairness for those involved. And just quickly around my other core functions, the protective disclosures is the whistleblower function that my office has, referred by IBAC. I investigate parliamentary referrals. I get a lot of referrals from Parliament. The last one of those was in relation to a certain MP named Jeff Shaw. But actually, the beating heart of my office really is that top corner, which is public complaints. And those are the everyday complaints that we get from the public in the tens of thousands every year. Every day, my team deals with situations where we help people in Victoria who are dealing with an unfairness, which may seem small in the grand scheme of things, but actually, to them, may well have a very profound. Because we understand that by the time a person has found, you know, their way to my office, you know, they have usually by phone, you know, usually they have been around, they've been dealing with agency, they're frustrated, they've been angry, and they may well have been around the problem quite a few times with quite a few people. So we want people to come to the Ombudsman if they are dissatisfied with the way they have been treated by the state or the government department. And what we would do in dealing with that complaint basically is ask these key questions. If it's something we can deal with, was it fair? Was the way they were treated fair? Is the action that person, that body, that department which has taken reasonable? And if not, what can be done to fix it? Now, I have to say that in lots of the cases we deal with, we will look at the decisions made by the council, by the agency, and actually we will conclude that they were fair and they were reasonable, because actually fairness is a two-way street. And you say, yeah. And people aren't always happy with that. We understand that. And sometimes things may not be fair, but actually you look at the case and you say, well, what can be done? You know, is there any meaningful outcome? Is there any practical outcome that can be achieved by this? What can we do? And sometimes the answer is no, in which case that's, you know, we won't launch investigation, we won't, that will be, you know, that is a very sorry, but we can't help you. So, you know, I'm very aware, and this is true anywhere in the complaints business, you cannot please everyone. And that's actually not really the role. The role is to be fair. And sometimes people don't like those outcomes. But let me give you some examples to illustrate we can do. So, we get lots of complaints about parking tickets, funnily enough. Now, mostly we don't deal with complaints about parking tickets because actually, in my act, if you have a remedy elsewhere, normally you have to follow that remedy. So normally if you've got to write a remedy to VCAT or elsewhere, you're expected to follow that. So by and large, I don't deal with these complaints about the parking tickets. But we do have a discretion, which we will exercise if people are particularly vulnerable. Now, the complaint that came in this case was from a homeless person with a learning disability. Now, he was driving a friend who also had a disability to a conference at a local church. And he parked in a designated disabled parking bay with a valid permit. Now, he needed to move the car after about 2 hours. We did. So he then parked in a permit zone because the only other disabled parking bay was blocked by a trailer. So here's his car. What happens? He gets a parking infringement for $87. You know, and he says, well, hang on a second, what was I to do about this? You know, I tried to park in a disabled zone and it was blocked by a trailer. And he made 2 requests to the council for a review of the infringement. And they were both denied on the grounds that a disabled parking permit offers no exemption of parking in a permit zone, which is actually true. Okay? The council were acting within the law. But was it fair? Was the question. So in this case, my office exercised its discretion to make inquiries with the council. We didn't just say, sorry, you can go to VCAT, you know, goodbye. We made inquiries with the council, but we thought it was unreasonable to expect this particular complainant had to take legal proceedings when he was homeless and had a learning disability. So we asked the council to reconsider their position on the infringement notice on the basis of the complainant's circumstances, and happy to say they've agreed to do so. Now, the fact is, we can't force the council to change its mind, we can't force them to withdraw the infringement, but actually it's acted within its powers. But actually, what we are able to do is get them to rethink. Because all too often, this strict application of the law ends in a result that actually just leaves a bad taste in your mouth. You think, you know, it may not be the greatest injustice in the world, but it's really not fair. So another example. This involves a device beloved by many of us, I'm sure you are aware, the Nike card. Now, our involvement in this case actually came out, and these are both very recent cases. I mean, I could have plucked, you know, hundreds at random, you know, from the cases that my staff deal with every day. In this case, the complainant's mother had contacted our office to complain that the Department of Transport refused to revoke an infringement notice given to her 17-year-old son. And he'd been given that infringement for travelling on a senior's card. Okay, so what happened? Well, this particular young man did actually have a Mikey. He had his own annual Mikey. He was getting a lift home with his grandparents. Didn't think he'd need his Mikey, so he left it at home. Now his grandmother, who had cancer, fell ill during the ride home, and his grandfather had to take her urgently to hospital. Now at this point, the young man needed to get home, so he borrowed his grandfather's Mikey. Fortunately, it was a senior's card, which of course he didn't realise, And as sod's law would have it, because it always happens this way, on his way home, he's stopped by authorised officers, and they say, you're travelling on a senior's card, and they gave him an infringement. His grandmother, who was taken ill that night, very sadly died. The young man gets sick, and not unreasonably, he thought that was pretty unfair. So, after contact from his mother, my office intervened, and I'm very happy to report that the Department of Transport, in this case, agreed to withdraw the infringement. Oh, Gulen's maxim again. In all these cases, the department or agency, and we've seen this all the time, they reviewed their own work. You know, it's a bit of a nudge from the Ombudsman, you know, but they reviewed their own work, and they found themselves to be wanting. Even they're acting within the letter of the law. So I'm not dwelling on their shortcomings in this case. I'm looking at the case in the round, and I see the public sector has responded, and they've solved the problem. Bravo, those women and men, I say. Now, I'd like to give you a third case that actually took a little bit more effort, and it's one that you may or may not have heard of, because this actually was a public case. And this is the case of Mr. and Mrs. Forsey. Now, Mr. and Mrs. Forsey actually had a farm in Gippsland, in a place delightfully known as Jumbuck. And it's very hilly country, and a very heavy rains one day, and a landslip cuts off access to their farm. And that is the state of the road. Can't get to the farm. So they go to the council, want the road fixed, and they complain. Now, for the next year, the council and various agencies, Treasury, Finance, you know, state, federal, you name it, argue over who is responsible for fixing the road. And in the meantime, Mr. and Mrs. Forsey can't get back to their farm, and their sheep are dying. So finally, after about a year, they complained to the Ombudsman. And at first the office made inquiries, what's going on here, as we do in the other cases, and normally inquiries get resolved. In this case, they were taking their time, so the Ombudsman, this is my predecessor I'm talking about here, launched a formal investigation. And this is what happened 2 weeks after the start of the formal investigation. Now, I wasn't in the role at the time, but I can guess that this is the result of what the Attorney General in 1973 in those debates described as the persuasive powers of the Ombudsman. Now, the council probably did not have a legal duty to reinstate that road. And I very much doubt that a court would have given the Forseys a remedy. But actually, an ombudsman can ask, how fair and reasonable is it for an elderly couple who rely on a public road to feed their livestock to be left stranded with their sheep? Now, I think most people acquainted with the Forsey story would probably think that a just outcome was achieved by my office. Now, only this case is actually, of the various cases I've given you, and the hundreds and thousands of others I could also give you, has actually been a sort of a report tabled in Parliament, because they don't make the papers. But they are daily, weekly, hourly even instances of those times when the Ombudsman has been able to do something to redress this imbalance of power between the individual and the state. Now, I would quite like to be able to do more, actually. I'd like to be able to deal with more complaints. I'd like to be able to do more with them. Because even if they're very quickly resolved, even if they don't require investigation, every complaint is an expression of someone's dissatisfaction. And every complaint is free feedback to government, to its agencies, about some aspect of what it's doing that somebody's unhappy with, and how some part of it they think is not doing its job. Because complaints can be really powerful indicators, all kinds of things. Deeper problems in agencies, patterns of complaints can highlight problems with individuals or cultures, failings in areas that need improvement. There's lots of government departments that still see a kind of cultural reluctance to see complaints as a good thing. Now, again, a few months ago, I tabled a report in Parliament on local councils dealing with complaints. And one of the, it was a very collaborative effort. We worked very closely with local councils to produce a good practice guide on dealing with complaints. But there was one sort of point of contention that came up with this, which I think really illustrates this cultural reluctance. And And I used the an overflowing bin somewhere in the course of it, the missed bin collection as the example. Is a missed bin collection a complaint? Because actually there are a number of councils who said, no, you don't think it, if somebody complains that the waste collector missed my bin, that's not a complaint. We don't think it's a complaint. Actually, we don't want to count it as a complaint because, well, there are so many of them and people always lie about putting their bins out. Okay, actually, there is a difference between a complaint and a request for service. But if you say, I'm unhappy, I'm dissatisfied that my bin was not collected, that is actually a complaint. And it should be recorded as a complaint. It doesn't mean that the outcome should be an investigation. It simply means that you're noting that and that becomes part of a pattern. So that if, for example, you're dealing with hundreds or thousands of complaints about missed bin collections, then that's telling you something as a council that you've got a problem with the people you've contracted your waste collection to. So this is the kind of thing that I want to be able to do more of. And actually, complaints are all the more important when you're dealing with marginalised members of the community. Because as everybody in my world knows, the people actually who need the service of the Ombudsman the most are usually the ones who've heard about it the least. People who are vulnerable in some way because of language, culture, disability, health, you name it. People who don't have access to the papers or the internet. And there are all kinds of reasons why people aren't familiar with the services. So one of the things that I've done, part of this journey, is an outreach program where I want to get out more and talk to people in Victoria about what I do, what the office does, how we can help them. Because actually we know, and we know this from the research, people in regional Victoria, Aboriginal Victorians, young people, disabled people, are actually the least likely to come to us. So, as you can see here, to tackle this point and to reinforce the points that I am the Victorian Ombudsman, that I am not the Melbourne Ombudsman, I'm hitting the road between now and the end of the year. Because I want to go and talk to local community groups, and I want to talk to state government staff and councils actually across Victoria. This is all part of a longer term strategy for increasing people's awareness of what the office is and what it can do for people and how they can get in touch with us. There's another aspect of this as well. The complaints landscape in Victoria is pretty confused, as you can see, and actually that isn't everybody. That's only a part of the number of bodies there are across the state of Victoria that deal with complaints in various forms. I'm not an ombudsman around, for example. There actually are several of us, and there's been quite a growth in ombudsman and complaints handling bodies across the state. So I'd like to make it easier for people to complain, and for those complaints to get to the right place. So that rather than having to figure out, as a member of the public, which one of these bodies you should be dealing with, which I've got to tell you, even as the Ombudsman, I struggle with sometimes, I'd like, what I want to do is to create a single complaints portal that would allow people to have access. It would send people in the right direction. So, it would be a kind of one-stop shop, for complaints handling in Victoria. And on the subject of marginalised members of the community, who may not use the internet, one of the other things I'm very keen to do is develop materials for third-party advocates, for community legal centres and financial counsellors and the like, people who tend to deal directly with marginalised members of the community, so that they can then communicate to them, people who are most in need of our services. Now, some of what I want to do will require changes to legislation. It hasn't fundamentally changed since 1973. I've given the government my current shopping list and looking forward to the response, which had better be yes. Because, for example, as the Ombudsman Act currently stands, you can only complain to my office in writing. That's a requirement, even though 3/4 of contacts to my office are on the phone. So, that's very excluding, particularly for marginalised members of the community. And that's one of the things that I'm really keen to have changed. It raises real questions about fairness for people in that environment. So, as you can see, there's a lot going on, but it all heads, I think, in the kind of general direction of ensuring that all Victorians have a voice, and that we work to redress that imbalance of power between the individual and the state, and a greater level of fairness in government decision. Because complaints are an excellent way, as Goodwin says, of holding yourself to account first. That's how we improve, either as individuals or organisations. So that's the journey. 1809 in Sweden, 1973 in Victoria, and for me, as the 5th Ombudsman of Victoria, looking ahead to 2024. I want to use the functions and the powers that have been given to me by Parliament to the best possible effect in the interests of justice and fairness. And it's the marginalised members of our community, people without money and lawyers or health or language familiarity, who actually need it the most. Now, I know it's going to be a challenge, it always is, because making decisions in the interests of justice is not a popularity contest. It's never going to win you there. And that's probably why I've been given a 10-year term. But here's an offer to the AIS. Invite me back here in 2024 to talk about fairness for marginalised members of the community, so I can tell you about the great work we've done to make that a reality. That's a promise. Thank you. Good afternoon.